Dorothy Callahan hit the ground before anyone caught her. One moment she was on the stage step. The next, she was on her knees in the Texas dirt. One hand pressed to her ribs, the other flat on the ground, holding herself up by sheer refusal to fall further. Nobody moved. 20 people on that Harding Creek street, and not one of them moved. They stood and they watched a woman bleed quietly into the dust, and they found somewhere else to look. Wade Hargrove was already walking before he knew he'd decided to. If you're watching from somewhere across this country, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far Dorothy and Wade's story travels. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and don't you dare leave before the end. Because what these two people build from nothing in the dust of the Texas Panhandle will remind you that second chances are real, and they are worth every scar it costs to get there. The stage from Amarillo was late.
Wade Hargrove stood outside the Harding Creek Territorial Office with his hat in his hands and the particular stillness of a man who had spent years learning that stillness was the only honest response to situations he couldn't control. He'd been standing there 40 minutes. He'd counted the buildings on Main Street twice. 17, if you were generous about what counted as a building. He wasn't generally generous, but he had time. He should not have come into town looking like this. Clean shirt, fresh shave. He'd even paid Hector Munoz's boy a nickel to shine his boots, which was the kind of thing a man did when he was trying to convince himself something was purely practical and failing at the convincing. Tom Briggs from the feed store had already looked at him twice with an expression that suggested he was storing the information for later use. The barber's wife had whispered something to the minister's wife, and they had both looked and then looked away, which was the Harding Creek version of a headline. Let them have it. Wade had answered the matrimonial advertisement on a Tuesday night in November, when the wind was working its way through the cabin walls the way it did every November. Mean and patient and indifferent to anything he'd built to stop it. He'd written the letter in 15 minutes, mailed it before sunrise, spent the following 3 weeks telling himself it was a practical decision made by a practical man who needed help with 400 acres, and had run out of arguments for why solitude was preferable to company. The agency's response had come 9 days ago. He'd read it twice. Then he'd saddled his horse and ridden the fence line for 2 hours without checking a single post, which told him more about his state of mind than he cared to admit. Stage is coming. Billy Alcott hollered it from his post on the water barrel, pointing east with the authority of a boy who had decided that watching the road was a profession and intended to be excellent at it. Wade heard the wheels, heard the team working hard on the last grade before town. He put his hat back on, settled it, and waited. The stage rocked around the bend, trailing its curtain of pale dust. Silas Cobb brought it to a stop with the brakes shrieking and the horses blowing hard. He climbed down from the box, caught Wade's eye, and in the half-second that followed, communicated something Wade didn't have a word for yet. Not pity, not warning. Something that lived between the two. The coach door swung open. A hand gripped the doorframe. Small. The knuckles scraped raw. 2 of them split and healed over in thick pink lines that were maybe a week old. Then a boot on the step. Then the woman herself, turning sideways to manage the angle. And Wade saw her face in full as she came down, and the bottom of something in his chest went out. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut. The bruising covered that entire side of her face, deep purple-black at the cheekbone, bleeding into sickly green at the jaw. The colors of damage that was several days past its worst, but nowhere near done with her. Her lip had been cut and had healed crooked. She held her left arm tight against her ribs with the careful discipline of someone who had calculated exactly how much movement she could afford and was spending it deliberately. She stepped off the final step and her leg buckled. Not all the way. She caught herself, one hand going to the coach wheel, and brought herself back upright in the single motion that was so fast and practiced it was clearly not the first time she'd done it. She straightened, lifted her chin, looked at the street in front of her with eyes that were doing rapid, experienced work, counting exits, reading faces, cataloging threat. Nobody on that street moved toward her. Mabel Briggs pulled her daughter physically sideways. The barber turned back to his customer. Two cowboys outside the saloon found something interesting to study in the middle distance. Billy Alcott, 8 years old, and not yet taught that looking away was the respectable thing, stared with open, uncomplicated concern from his water barrel. 20 people, not one step forward. Wade covered the distance in 10 strides. "Ma'am?" He stopped in front of her, not too close, and removed his hat. "I'm Wade Hargrove." She turned to the sound of his voice and looked at him directly. Her good eye was gray-green, the color of the sky about an hour before weather arrived. She was running some fast and private calculation behind it. "Mr. Hargrove." Her voice was level, educated. Whatever it was costing her to make it level, she was paying it. "I'm Dorothy Callahan." She paused a half-beat. "I apologize for the—" She stopped herself mid-sentence. Reset. "I'm Dorothy Callahan." That stopped sentence landed on Wade like something physical. The instinct so deep it had almost finished itself. Apologizing for being hurt, in public, in front of a stranger she'd never met, for the crime of arriving damaged. She'd caught it, but it had been there. "No apology needed," he said. "Are you hurt anywhere that needs a doctor today?" "No doctor." Fast, certain, pre-decided. "All right." He didn't push it. "Trunk?" "Only the bag." She held up the carpet bag in her right hand. Left arm stayed where it was, guarding those ribs. Silas Cobb materialized at Wade's elbow and held out a sealed envelope without ceremony or explanation. Wade took it. Cobb looked at Dorothy Callahan for exactly 1 second with an expression that contained something that might have been shame if he'd let it finish forming, then turned and climbed back to his box. "Wagon's across the street," Wade said. "Whenever you're ready." He didn't offer his arm. Every instinct said to. Western courtesy, basic human decency. But he'd been reading people for a living for 11 years, and what he read off Dorothy Callahan in that moment was that a stranger's touch, even a careful one, would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend in public. So he walked beside her instead. Close. Ready. Giving her the 30 feet to his wagon on her own terms. She made every step, climbed up herself, right hand on the side rail, breathing through her nose on the step that required her to raise her left arm, settled onto the bench and put her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. Wade untied the horses and they moved. Harding Creek fell behind them. The land opened up the way Texas land did, flat and enormous and indifferent. The sky taking up 3/4 of everything. He waited until the last building was out of sight before he broke the envelope's seal. 1 page. A woman's handwriting, precise and unhurried. Mr. Hargrove. By the time you read this, you will have seen Mrs. Callahan's condition. I will not soften what I have to tell you. She came to our bureau 6 weeks ago, having left the Callahan family household in St. Louis under circumstances she described as no longer survivable. Our physician examined her on arrival and documented his findings in full. I have those documents. The man responsible is her father-in-law, Harlon Callahan, a person of considerable commercial standing in Missouri. He has contacted this bureau twice since her departure, framing his inquiries as concern for a grieving widow's stability. Mrs. Callahan is not unstable. She is, however, in genuine danger if she is found unmarried and without legal protection. She cannot go back. She has no family. She has $43 and what fits in one bag. She is 28 years old, and she is one of the most quietly courageous people I have encountered in 14 years of this work. The choice is yours. I am being honest with you, because she deserves that honesty to be done on her behalf, even when she is not in the room. Respectfully, Agnes Howell, Western Territories Matrimonial Bureau, Amarillo. Wade folded the letter, put it in his jacket pocket, read the horizon for a while. Beside him, Dorothy Callahan sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, and said nothing. It wasn't the quiet of someone waiting for permission. It was the quiet of someone who had learned that silence was armor, and hadn't yet decided whether she needed it here. "I read the letter," he said. "I assumed you would. It says you left because things were no longer survivable." "That's accurate." "Your father-in-law." A pause. The horses moved. The grass moved in long, slow waves. "Frank died 2 years ago," she said. The facts worn smooth from repetition, the way grief became a road you'd walked so many times you stopped seeing what was on either side of it. "Fever. 9 days. Harlon told me at the funeral that Frank had died with debts, that the property was held in Harlon's name and always had been." She stopped. "He told me I was welcome to remain in the household, in a management capacity." He meant unpaid. He meant something he had full legal authority over. She said it with the flatness of a woman who had run out of the energy required for bitterness and arrived somewhere quieter and more dangerous on the other side of it. "Harlon Callahan has never struck a woman in anger. He's very precise about that. He doesn't lose his temper. He reduces you, slowly and carefully over time. Controls what you eat and who you speak to. Has his physician certify in writing that you're showing signs of grief-induced instability when you push back. It's methodical." Her jaw was set hard. "The bruises are from the night I told him I had contacted the Matrimonial Bureau." Wade's hands tightened on the reins. He made them loosen. "How did you get out?" "His housekeeper, Vera." The name came out differently than the rest of it. Softer, like something she was being careful with. "She's worked for the Callahans 20 years. She unlocked the back door at 3 in the morning and put me in her nephew's wagon without saying goodbye. Because if she said goodbye, she would cry, and crying made noise." Dorothy looked at the road ahead of them. "I left her my mother's brooch. It was the only thing I had that fit in my hand." Wade said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be worth the interruption. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," she said. "I'm telling you so you understand what's behind me, because it isn't nothing, and you deserve to know that before we go any further." "I appreciate that." He glanced at her. "My turn." She looked at him. 3 years ago, I was working for the Pinkerton Agency in Colorado," he said. "Mining strike. I was given an order to move my people forward against a line of workers." He said it straight, the way you said something you had decided a long time ago to stop dressing up. 3 men died. They weren't armed. I gave the signal. A beat. I told myself I was following lawful orders. I told myself other people's hands had done the actual. He stopped. Doesn't matter what I told myself. I gave the signal. I knew what would happen. And I've been trying to figure out what kind of man does that, and what kind of man he has left to become, ever since. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. "Because you told me the truth about what's behind you. Seemed only right to tell you the truth about what's behind me." She looked at him with those gray-green eyes doing their fast, careful work. "So we're both running," she said. "I'm not running anymore," he said. "I stopped running when I bought 400 acres and put my name on the deed. I'm just living with it. There's a difference." "Is there?" "I'm still figuring that out." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had both said true things and were giving the truth room to settle. "I'm not a burden looking for somewhere soft to land," Dorothy said. Her voice had changed, less careful now, more direct, like something had been established between them that allowed a different register. "I ran a household and a working cattle operation for 2 years without being paid or credited for it. I know livestock. I know land. I know preservation and winter stores, and what to do when a fence goes at 3 in the morning in January."
She paused. "I also know that Harlon Callahan does not accept being walked away from, and that he has money and lawyers and the patience of a man who has never once been told no and had to accept it."
"I know that too." Agnes Howell's letter was clear.
"Then you know this arrangement just became considerably more complicated than two adults seeking mutual benefit."
"My life was considerably uncomplicated before today," Wade said.
Starting to think that was the problem.
Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile. A small, involuntary softening, there and gone before it could commit to anything. The split in her lip caught, and she touched it once with 2 fingers. The gesture so quick and unconscious it was clearly a habit. Checking, always checking the inventory of damage.
"When does it stop hurting?" she asked.
A practical question from a practical woman. "Ribs, 4 to 6 weeks if they're cracked. Bruising goes yellow before it clears. Probably another 10 days.
The lip heals clean." He'd seen enough injury in enough places to know the schedule. "You'll notice it less by end of week." "And the other kind?" He looked at the road. "Longer," he said, "but it does go." She absorbed this. "I don't trust easily," she said. "That's the only reasonable response to your life so far. I'm going to watch you for a while before I decide what you are." "Fair." "And if I decide you're what you appear to be," she said it like a woman unaccustomed to the sentence being allowed to finish, "then I will work harder than anyone you have ever had beside you. I promise you that."
Wade looked at the horizon. At the land he'd been working alone for 2 years. The fence lines and the water, and the 400 acres that had given him somewhere to put his hands, while his mind worked through what he'd done in Colorado, and whether there was anything left of him worth the trouble of continuing. "You said you know cattle," he said. "I know cattle. My south pasture fence has been giving me trouble since February." "What kind of trouble?" "Post rot on the east side. Cattle keep finding it. You'll want to pull the whole section and reset. Patching post drive is a waste of a day." He nodded once. "That's what I thought." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different silence than before. Smaller, less weighted. The silence of 2 people who had exchanged enough truth to know they were not starting from nothing. The land changed as they moved north. The cottonwoods along the seasonal creek came into view first. Then the slow rise toward his property line, the grass shifting quality and color in the way he'd learned to read like a language. His land. His name on the deed and the county records in Amarillo. "This is mine from here," he said. Dorothy looked. Took it in slowly, the way someone looks at a thing they are making a decision about. "Nobody can see it from the road," she said. That was intentional. She turned to look at him then, and something passed across her face. Recognition, maybe, of a specific kind of thought. The kind that lives in people who have learned that being findable is a liability. "Mine too," she said quietly. The homestead appeared as they topped the last rise. Cabin low and solid in the draw. Cottonwoods on the west throwing shade across the porch. Barn set back 30 yards, weathered gray but sound. The windmill turning over the well, its slow creak carrying in the still air. The kitchen garden plot unworked since October, going to weeds, waiting. Wade pulled the team up. "Roof sound," he said. "Chimney draws well. Spring-fed well that doesn't go foul in summer. It's rough inside because I've been working it alone, and a man alone tends to let the inside of things go." Dorothy was looking at the homestead with an expression he couldn't read. Not disappointment. Not relief exactly. Something more careful than both.
"Is there a door on the bedroom?" she said. "Yes." "With a latch?" "Yes." She nodded once, got down from the wagon herself, right hand on the rail, careful on the step, and walked to the cabin without waiting for him. She put her palm flat against the log wall, stood there a moment with her hand on it, like she was listening for something. Then she looked back at him over her shoulder. "It'll do," she said, and then, quieter, almost to herself, looking back at the land in every direction, the grass and the sky, and the enormous Texas quiet with nobody in it for miles. "It'll do very well." Wade unhitched the horses and got them to water, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that for the first time in 3 years, the cabin he was walking back toward had a light in the window that he hadn't put there. He'd spent 3 years asking himself whether he was still a man worth trusting. He didn't have the answer yet. But Dorothy Callahan was inside his cabin, with the door open, waiting to find out. And Harlon Callahan, somewhere back in St. Louis, in his ordered house with his organized cruelty, did not yet know where she was. That clock, Wade understood, had already started running. The first morning, Wade woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving in his kitchen like they knew what they were doing. He lay in the loft for a moment, staring at the rough-hewn beams overhead, adjusting to the fact that the sounds were real, not something his half-asleep mind had manufactured out of 2 years of wanting them. Real footsteps, real fire crackling in the stove, real coffee, strong enough to announce itself through the loft boards. He came down the ladder quietly and found Dorothy Callahan standing at his stove in her gray dress, her dark red hair already pinned up, turning salt pork in the iron skillet with the focused economy of someone who had been cooking over fire for years and had never once thought of it as anything other than work that needed doing. She didn't startle when she heard him. She just said, without turning around, "I found eggs. I hope that's all right. And your coffee tin was almost empty, so I used what was left. You'll need more before the week's out." "I was going to say the same thing," Wade said. "There's a crack in the south wall of your barn, low on the left side as you go in, about a foot long. It'll let in water when the spring rains come." He stopped midway through pulling on his boots. "How do you know about the barn?" "I was up at 5. I walked the property." She turned then, holding the skillet, and looked at him with those gray-green eyes that were already busy with the day. The bruising had darkened overnight, deep purple spreading further along her jaw than it had appeared yesterday, and she was holding herself with that same careful rationing of movement. But her eyes were clear and awake and entirely her own. "Your east fence line has 3 posts that need resetting, not just the south pasture. And your garden plot is workable. The soil's good under the weed cover. You've just been neglecting it." "I have been neglecting it." "I'm not criticizing. I'm making a list." She put the skillet back on the heat. "Sit down. Food's ready." Wade sat down. He couldn't remember the last time someone had told him to sit down in his own kitchen, and he'd simply done it. They ate in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable yet, but wasn't strained either. It was the silence of 2 people who had agreed on something significant the day before, and were now in the business of figuring out what that agreement looked like when translated into the ordinary minutes of a day. Wade watched Dorothy eat, with the focused attention of someone making sure a meal was real and present in front of her, not taking it for granted, not rushing. She ate everything on her plate. "How long since you ate properly?" he asked.
She looked up. Is it that obvious? You ate like a woman who's been rationing. Something moved across her face. Harlon controlled the household accounts, she said, including what was purchased for the kitchen, including portions. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact about weather or terrain. I learned to make a small amount cover a long way. Wade put his fork down carefully. That won't be a problem here. I know. She looked at him steadily. I know it won't.
That's the first thing I decided about you this morning. What else did you decide? She considered the questions seriously, which he was already learning was what she did with questions. She didn't deflect them, and she didn't rush them. That you work this place alone because you choose to, she said, not because you have to. You could hire a hand. You have enough operation here to justify it. But you don't. She tilted her head slightly. Same reason I walk the fence line at 5 in the morning. Easier to see the shape of things when nobody's watching you look. Wade picked up his fork again. What's the verdict? The shape of this place is a man who works hard and doesn't quit, she said. But who's been doing everything himself for so long, he's stopped seeing what he's missing. A pause. That's not a criticism either. I didn't take it as one. She almost smiled. Then she stood, took both plates, and began washing them with her right hand, her left arm still held against her ribs. Stop, Wade said. I'm fine. You're favoring your left side harder than yesterday. Sit down and let me do that. I've been managing my own pain for 2 years, Mr. Hargrove. I don't need... Wade. She stopped, looked at him. We're sharing a kitchen, he said. You called me Wade yesterday in the wagon. I'd like you to keep doing that. A beat of silence. I called you Mr. Hargrove just now without thinking, she said slowly. Harlon required formal address from everyone in the house at all times. It was one of his... She stopped, set the plate down. Wade, she said his name like she was testing the weight of it. The dishes can wait, but I want you to understand something. I'm not going to stop working because something hurts. If I stop every time something hurts, I'll stop permanently, and that is not something I'm willing to do. I'm not asking you to stop, he said. I'm asking you to let someone else carry the part you can't right now. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat back down. All right, she said. But I want that understood as a temporary arrangement, not a permanent one. It's understood. He washed the dishes. She watched the window. Outside, the morning light was moving across the land the way it did in early spring in Texas, low and golden, and completely serious about its business. Tell me about the cattle operation, she said. How many head, what pastures, how you've been rotating? So he told her, and she listened the way people listen when they actually intend to use the information. Asking specific questions at specific moments, not polite questions, but precise ones. The kind that revealed she already understood the structure of what he was describing and was filling in gaps, not building from nothing. When he mentioned the south pasture fence problem, she nodded. Post rock comes from water pooling at the base, she said. Frank's family ran Herefords in Missouri on wet ground. I fought that same problem for a full season. You need to grade the soil away from the base when you reset, not just pull and replant. I was planning to do it flat. Then you'll be resetting again in 3 years. How do you grade it? She told him, precisely and practically, with the kind of specificity that only came from having done it wrong once and right once and knowing the difference. Wade listened and understood that whatever Agnes Howell's letter had said about Dorothy Callahan's courage, it had left out that she was also deeply competent, and that the competence was something she had built herself, the hard way, from years of doing work she wasn't given credit for. He spent the morning on the fence line.
She had insisted she was coming. He had told her she was not going to be riding across rough pasture with cracked ribs 2 days off a stagecoach. They had negotiated, which Wade was already learning was what happened when two people who were both accustomed to being right disagreed about something. The negotiation ended with Dorothy staying at the homestead and organizing the root cellar, which she had described as a disaster when she'd inspected it that morning. "It's not a disaster," Wade said. "You have last year's seed potatoes in the same section as this year's turnips," she said. "It's a disaster." He rode out to the south pasture and spent 4 hours pulling bad posts, grading soil, and resetting with fresh timber he'd been storing in the barn for this purpose. Hard work. Physical work. The kind that quieted everything in a man's head except the immediate problem in front of his hands. He was grateful for it. He had too many things in his head that needed quieting. Chief among them was the letter. Not what it said, what it meant. Harlon Callahan was a man with money and lawyers and the patience of someone who had never had to accept no. He would look. He was probably already looking. The Matrimonial Bureau in Amarillo had been careful. Agnes Howell had said so. But careful only went so far, against the kind of money that could hire 4 investigators and offer a reward, and simply wait until one of the 4,000 small ways a person left a trace in the world produced a result. Dorothy had said Harlon did not accept being walked away from. Wade had known men like that, had worked alongside them, had, he acknowledged to himself with the honest portion of his thinking, been contracted by men like that in his Pinkerton years, and had done their business without asking too many questions about who was being protected and who was being kept in line. He had been good at his work. That was the part that stayed with him in the dark. Not that he'd been following orders, but that he'd been good at following them, and efficient, and had not once stopped to ask who was paying the cost. He reset the last post and stood back and looked at the fence line, straight and solid now, and thought about clocks that had already started running. When he rode back to the homestead in the early afternoon, Dorothy was on the porch. She had a tin cup in her right hand, and she was watching the south horizon with an expression that she put away quickly when she heard his horse, replacing it with something more neutral. But he'd seen it. He knew what that particular kind of watching looked like. He'd done enough of it himself. He unsaddled his horse and came to the porch. She poured him coffee from the pot she'd brought out with her, and he sat on the step below where she stood and drank it. "The fence is done," he said. "I know. I can see you from here." She sat down on the porch edge. "I've been watching the road." "I noticed." "Is that a problem?" "No." He turned the cup in his hands. "It means you're thinking about what comes next. That's smart." "That's survival." She said it without self-pity. "Harlon will look for me. I've been telling myself since Amarillo that I had time, that he'd need weeks to trace where I went. But the truth is, I don't know how much time I have, and pretending otherwise doesn't help either of us." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." "I want you to tell me honestly," she said, "what you think our situation is. Not the reassuring version, the honest one." Wade looked at the horizon she'd been watching. "The honest version is that you're safer here than you were in St. Louis, but not safe in any permanent way until your legal situation changes. A married woman has protections, an unmarried one doesn't. Your father-in-law's guardianship claim is weaker if you're someone else's wife, and a good deal harder to enforce if you're 3 states away from his lawyer's jurisdiction." He looked at her. "The honest version is also that Harlon Callahan sounds like a man who'll try every legal avenue before he tries anything else, because legal is cleaner, and he can claim virtue the whole way through it." Dorothy's jaw tightened. "That's exactly what he'll do." "Which gives us some time. Legal processes are slow, but it's not unlimited time." "How much?" "Weeks. Maybe a few months, if Agnes Howell is as careful as her letter suggests. He paused. I want to send a letter to the county sheriff in Amarillo. Not reporting anything, just establishing that you're here, that you arrived of your own free will, that you're employed on my property. Creates a record. Makes it harder for Harlon to tell a story where you simply vanished. She was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this already.
I've been setting fence posts for 4 hours. I think while I work. So do I. She looked at the horizon again. I thought about it all morning while I was fixing your root cellar, which, by the way, now makes sense, and reseeding your kitchen garden, which I went ahead and started because waiting seemed wasteful. Wade looked past her at the garden plot. The weeds were cleared. The soil was turned, dark and clean, in 3 distinct rows. She'd done that with cracked ribs in a single morning. Dorothy, I told you, I work through pain. That's not... I was going to say, it looks good. She blinked, looked at the garden herself, then back at him. Oh. A pause. I planted the cool season crops first. Carrots, onions, the greens. It's late enough in spring that they'll catch if we get decent rain. We. She heard it. Looked at him carefully. I used that word yesterday in the wagon, too. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not assuming things about what this is. I just think in terms of we now, when I'm looking at a shared operation. It's a habit. It's not a bad habit, Wade said. She looked at him for a moment, that gray-green measuring gaze doing its work. You're very careful about not making me feel pressured, she said. I notice that. Seems like the minimum a person in my position owes a person in yours. Most men don't see it that way. Most men didn't spend a decade watching people with power tell themselves it was care, he said quietly. Something shifted in her face. Not dramatically. Dorothy Callahan did not do things dramatically. He was already understanding that about her. But something eased. A degree of vigilance that had been present in every line of her body since she'd stepped off that stage loosened, just slightly, just enough to notice. My mother used to say, she said after a moment, that you could tell everything you needed to know about a man by watching how he treated the people who couldn't leave. She turned the tin cup in her hands. She didn't have a very good marriage. She said it took her years to understand what she'd been watching. What did she tell you to look for? Whether he only behaved well when there was an audience. She looked at him directly. I watched you walk across that street in Harding Creek when nobody else moved. That was my first data point. I didn't do it for an audience. I know. That's the data point. She stood, picking up the coffee pot. I'm going to start supper. There's enough in your stores for a decent meal, and I found dried beans in the back of the pantry, behind about 3 years' worth of bachelorhood. I'm going to make something with them. I didn't know I had dried beans. I know. That's also data. She went inside. Wade stayed on the porch step with his empty cup and the long Texas afternoon spreading out in every direction. The windmill turned. The cattle were visible in the far pasture, small and slow-moving, doing what cattle did. The garden rows Dorothy had turned caught the afternoon light, dark against the pale soil around them. He thought about the letter he was going to write to the Amarillo sheriff, about the record it would create, and what kind of record Harlon Callahan was building on his end right now, in his organized and patient way, with his lawyers and his doctors who wrote things down for money. He thought about what Dorothy had said. Weeks, maybe a few months. Not enough time to do anything slowly. He had not come to that thought yet. Not fully, not in the form it was going to eventually arrive. But it was moving toward him the way weather moved across the flat Texas land. Visible from a long way off, unhurried, certain. Inside the cabin,
He could hear Dorothy moving, the specific sounds of a woman who knew what she was doing in a kitchen, purposeful and unrushed. The sounds of someone who had decided that this space was hers to inhabit, and intended to inhabit it fully. He'd built this place to be somewhere a man could disappear into his work and not be asked to account for himself. He'd been very successful at that for 2 years. He looked at the garden rose again, thought about the word "we," and how Dorothy had said it without meaning to, which was the only way a word like that ever told the truth. He went inside to help with supper, and outside on the south horizon, the road from Amarillo ran straight and flat and empty in the late afternoon light. Empty now. But Harlon Callahan had money and patience, and the kind of pride that had never once in 60 years been asked to bend. The road would not stay empty forever. Wade knew it. Dorothy knew it. They didn't say it out loud over supper, but it sat at the table with them just the same, quiet and certain, the way the most important things always did. 3 weeks passed, the way good weeks do on a working ranch, fast during the day and slow in the evenings, the hours filled with enough physical purpose that there wasn't much room left for the particular kind of thinking that kept a person awake. The south pasture fence held. The garden caught, thin green rows pushing up through the dark soil with the stubborn certainty of things that had been properly planted and intended to prove it. Dorothy's ribs healed on the schedule Wade had predicted, and then healed faster because she refused to give them any option but to keep up with her. She had a system for everything within 10 days of arriving. The root cellar reorganized by type and season. The barn swept and the tax sorted in a way that made Wade ashamed he'd let it get to the state it had been in. The chickens she'd traded for with a neighbor 15 miles south, 3 hens and a rooster acquired through a negotiation Wade had watched from a distance with something close to admiration, were installed in a coop she'd designed herself and he'd built to her specifications. The eggs appeared on the breakfast table every morning, like small daily arguments that things could be better than they were, and were, in fact, improving. He wrote the letter to the Amarillo sheriff. Dorothy read it before he sealed it, suggested 2 changes to the language that made it more precise and less easy to misread, and handed it back without comment. He sent it. He didn't know if it would matter. He thought it probably would, in the way that small, careful things mattered. Not dramatically, but cumulatively, building a record that told a true story before someone else arrived to tell a false one. What changed between them happened in the way that real things changed, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. The evening she sat at the table after supper and told him, without being asked, about Frank. Not the facts of him, the facts she'd given Wade in the wagon on the first day, worn smooth and manageable. The actual Frank. The way he'd laughed. The way he'd been, in the first years, genuinely kind before his father's weight had pressed down on him and flattened something essential. The way she had understood too late that marrying a good man and a weak one at the same time meant the weak one would eventually win. Wade had listened without interrupting, and when she finished he had said, "You don't have to explain why you stayed." And she had looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read and said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." The evening he'd come back from the north pasture with a gash across his left forearm from a wire catch, bleeding through his sleeve and holding it against his side the way she held her ribs in those first days. And she'd taken his arm without asking, cleaned it with the efficiency of someone who'd been dealing with injury in a working household for years, stitched it with 4 even passes of a needle that made him understand she'd done it before, and said, "You should wear the heavier gloves on the wire work." And he'd said, "I know." And she'd said, "Then why don't you?" And he'd said, "Same reason you kept working through the ribs." And she'd paused with the needle still in her hand and looked at him and almost laughed. Almost. She was getting closer to it. The almost laughs were coming more frequently, less controlled, more real. He was keeping count without meaning to. The morning she'd been up before him again, and he'd found her not in the kitchen, but on the porch, standing still, with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her eyes on the south road, with that particular quality of watching that was different from ordinary watching. Waiting watching. The kind that came from having learned that what you didn't see coming was always what hit you hardest. "Bad dream?" he'd asked. "No." She'd kept her eyes on the road. "I woke up thinking about something Vera told me once. She said Harlon always knew where the people who worked for him were. That he made it a point to know. That he said knowing where your people were was the foundation of good management." A pause. "She said it the way you say something that sounds reasonable until you hear yourself saying it." Wade had stood beside her and looked at the same road. "The sheriff in Amarillo will have gotten my letter by now." "I know." She turned her cup in her hands. "That helps with the legal side. It doesn't help with the other side." He hadn't asked her what the other side was. He knew. It was the side that lived in the body, the side that had nothing to do with legal documents and everything to do with 3 a.m. and back doors and the muscle-deep knowledge of what footsteps on a porch sounded like before anyone knocked. He put his hand on the porch rail beside hers and not said anything. And she'd looked down at his hand for a moment and then back at the road. And neither of them had moved for a while. And that had been enough. It was enough, that was the thing. What was building between them didn't require naming to be real. It didn't need to be declared or decided. It was simply there, in the mornings and the evenings and the working hours between them, in the way they'd stopped being careful around each other and started being honest instead, which was a different thing entirely. Wade understood that he was falling. He understood it with the same clear-eyed acknowledgement he tried to bring to most things that he couldn't change once they'd started. He didn't know what Dorothy understood. She was a woman who had learned to guard her interior life behind a face that gave away precisely as much as she chose, and not 1 degree more. But sometimes, in the unguarded seconds, when something surprised her, when the almost laugh got loose, when she looked at the garden rose and forgot for a moment to look like a woman who wasn't allowing herself to want things, he thought he had some idea. The riders came on a Thursday. Wade was at the barn, working on the loft ladder that had been threatening to give way for a month, when he heard the horses. He set down his tools and stepped out into the yard, and put a hand over his eyes against the afternoon sun, and watched 2 riders come over the rise from the south road. They weren't the same men who'd have come for Lillian Harper in Montana. These were different and somehow worse. Not hired range detectives with weather-beaten faces and practical eyes, but men in city clothes made deliberately practical. The kind of thing you wore when you wanted people to know you came from money, but were prepared to be somewhere that didn't. The lead rider was older, heavy through the chest, with iron-gray hair and the specific posture of a man accustomed to arriving places and being immediately taken seriously. He sat his horse like someone who had paid someone else to teach him to ride, and had been an excellent student. Wade knew who it was before the man pulled up 20 yards away. He'd seen enough powerful men to know the particular way power sat in a person's body when it had never been seriously challenged. Dorothy came out of the cabin behind him. He heard the door and then her footsteps stop on the porch. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the riders and said quietly, the way you said things you needed to be heard without being overheard, "Go inside. Bar the door." "No." Her voice was flat and certain. "Dorothy, no." She came off the porch and stood beside him, and he heard her breathing go controlled and deliberate, the way it had when her ribs were at their worst. Not pain now. Something else being managed. "I've been watching that road for 3 weeks," she said quietly. I'm not watching it from behind a door." The lead rider pulled up and looked down at Wade with a measured assessment of a man taking inventory. "You'd be Hargrove," he said, not a question. "I would," Wade said. "And you're on my land without an invitation." "Harlon Callahan." He said it the way people said names they expected to produce an effect. "I believe you have something of mine." The words hit the air and just stayed there. Wade felt Dorothy go absolutely still beside him. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks and had made certain decisions about how she would meet it. "I have 400 acres, a cattle operation, and a wife," Wade said. "None of which belong to you." Harlon Callahan looked at Dorothy then, for the first time, directly, with an expression that made Wade's hands want to close into fists. It wasn't anger. It was the calm appraisal of a man looking at property that had been misplaced and was now being recovered. Patient. Certain. As though the outcome was already settled, and this conversation was simply the procedure required to formalize it. "Dorothy," Harlon said, "you look well enough." A pause. "Considering?" "Mr. Callahan." Her voice was steady and completely without warmth. "You've wasted a long trip." "I don't consider it wasted. I consider it necessary." He shifted in his saddle. "Whatever arrangement you've made here, it doesn't change your legal situation. You left St. Louis while still under my guardianship. Anything entered into during that period without proper consent is—" "I'm 28 years old," Dorothy said. "You're 28 years old and a widow without independent standing, and my lawyer in St. Louis has filed the appropriate paperwork." He reached into his coat and produced a document, folded, which he extended toward Wade. "I have a writ here from a Missouri circuit judge." "Missouri jurisdiction ends at Missouri," Wade said. He didn't move to take the paper. "You're in Texas. That paper is worth what I decide it's worth, which is nothing." Harlon looked at him with the first real attention he'd given him since arriving. The kind of attention that was recalculating something. "Mr. Hargrove, I understand you may have become—" He chose the word with visible deliberation. "Attached. These things happen. But I want you to understand who you're involving yourself with. Dorothy has a history of instability. Her grief following Frank's death was severe. She's made accusations against me that are the product of a disordered mind, and I have medical documentation." "Stop!" Dorothy's voice cut across him like something physical. "Don't." He looked at her, and something in his expression, just for a fraction of a second, revealed what lived underneath the patience and the procedure and the careful language. Something that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with control, and the specific fury of control that had been refused. "You left without saying goodbye," he said, and his voice had changed, dropped out of the legal register into something quieter and more personal, and somehow more frightening for it. 20 years I provided for you, fed you, housed you, kept Frank's debts from destroying everything you had. You kept me," Dorothy said. "There's a difference. I kept you safe. You kept me hungry and isolated. And when I tried to leave, you put your hands on me." She said it clearly, in the open air, with the afternoon sun on her face and her voice not shaking at all. "I have scars. Vera watched you make them. And if you put that doctor's affidavit in front of any judge in this territory, I will stand up in that courtroom and I will show them every single one." Harlon Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the air. The second rider, who had said nothing, moved his horse slightly sideways. Not aggressive, almost the opposite. The subtle repositioning of a man who was recalculating his own role in whatever came next. "You've made your position clear," Harlon said finally, and the patience was back in his voice, deliberately reinstalled. And somehow, That was the most alarming thing he'd done yet. "I want you to make mine equally clear, Mr. Hargrove. I have resources, and I have time, and I have every legal avenue available to a man of my standing. This is not a negotiation. I will pursue every one of those avenues."
Your letter to the Amarillo sheriff was noted, incidentally. Thorough of you. But thorough doesn't mean conclusive. Wade had been standing very still since Harlon arrived. The stillness he'd learned in 11 years of Pinkerton work. The stillness that looked like patience and was actually something else entirely. The practiced quiet of a man deciding what kind of situation he was in and what it required of him. He took one step forward. Not aggressive, not rushed. Deliberate. "Let me tell you something about the kind of man I am," he said quietly. "I spent a decade doing work for men like you. Men with resources and patience and every legal avenue. Men who confused having power with being right." He held Callahan's gaze without blinking. "I know exactly how those men operate. I know their lawyers and their judges and their doctors who write things down for money. I know every step of the process you're describing because I used to help people like you run it." A pause. "Which means I also know exactly where every single step of it is breakable." Harlon looked at him. Really looked, for the first time, without the inventory assessment, without the performance of patience. Looked at him the way you looked at a problem that had just revealed itself to be more complicated than the initial estimate. "You'd do well to consider what you're risking," Harlon said. "I'd do well," Wade agreed, "but I've made worse decisions and survived them. The difference is, those decisions cost other people. This one is mine to make." He let that land. "Dorothy is my wife. She is on my land. She is here of her own free will. If you have a legitimate legal claim, you can file it with the Harding Creek Court, and I will respond to it through the appropriate channels. And we will see what a Texas judge thinks of a Missouri writ and a paid doctor's affidavit when Dorothy stands up in that courtroom and shows what I imagined she said she'd show." The second rider looked at Harlon. A look that communicated something Wade read clearly. They hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected Wade specifically. Hadn't built this version of the situation into their planning. Harlon refolded the document, put it back inside his coat with the careful movements of a man maintaining composure through an act of will. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Wade said, "but today it is." Harlon Callahan looked at Dorothy one more time. Whatever he was looking for, submission, fear, some evidence that what she'd built here was brittle enough to break with the right application of pressure. He didn't find it. Dorothy stood in the Texas afternoon with her chin level and her gray-green eyes steady, and looked at the man who had reduced her, slowly and methodically for 2 years, and did not look away. Then the two men turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come, south toward the Amarillo Road. And the dust from their horses hung in the air for a long time after they'd gone. Wade and Dorothy stood in the yard and watched until the dust was the only evidence they'd been there at all. He heard her exhale, long and controlled, the breath of someone releasing something they'd been holding for a very long time. "He came himself," she said. "I didn't think he'd come himself." "Means he's more invested than he wants to appear." "Or more angry." She was quiet for a moment. "He knew about your letter to the sheriff." "Yes." "That means he has someone watching the bureau in Amarillo, or someone in the postal service, or both." She turned to look at Wade. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. But something behind her eyes was working hard at something, processing at a speed that showed in the particular focus of her gaze. "He's not going to stop with legal filings." That was a warning. He wanted to look at us, wanted to see what he's dealing with. "I know.
And now he knows what he's dealing with. Now he knows, Wade agreed. She looked back at the road. The dust had nearly settled. The land was quiet and enormous, and utterly indifferent to Harlon Callahan and everything he intended. "I wasn't afraid," she said, as though she was reporting on something that surprised her. "When I saw him come over that rise, I thought I would be. I've been afraid of that man for 2 years. I've been afraid of the sound of his footsteps in the hall. I've been afraid of his voice." She touched her jaw once, unconsciously, where the bruising had been. Faded now, mostly gone. But when he was standing there in front of me, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. "That's progress," Wade said. She turned to look at him, and this time the almost laugh actually arrived. Brief and disbelieving, shaken loose by something she hadn't expected to feel. Exhausted and fierce and real, all at once. "That is the most understated thing you've ever said," she told him. "I'm a fairly understated person. I've noticed." She looked at him steadily. "Wade, what did you mean when you said you know where every step of his process is breakable?" He met her eyes. "I meant what I said." "I know you meant it. I want to know what it means." He looked at the road one more time, at the empty space where Harlon Callahan had been, and the much larger empty space where he was going, and the certain knowledge of what that space would eventually produce when a man with resources and patience and a specific kind of pride that had never once been made to bend decided that warnings hadn't been sufficient. "It means," Wade said, "that we need to move faster than he does, and that I have some letters to write tonight." He went inside. Dorothy stood in the yard for one more moment, looking south, and then she followed him. The door closed, and outside, the Texas evening came on slow and enormous, the sky turning colors that had no names, and the road from Amarillo lay flat and empty and patient in the fading light, the way a thing lies quiet before it moves. Wade wrote 4 letters that night. Dorothy sat across the table from him and read each one before he sealed it, making the same precise corrections she'd made to his letter to the Amarillo sheriff. A word changed here, a clause restructured there, the kind of edits that came from someone who understood that language was not decoration, but architecture, and that the wrong word in a legal document was a door left unlocked. The first letter went to a man named Curtis Briggs in Denver, no relation to Tom Briggs at the feed store, who had been the best contract lawyer Wade had known during his Pinkerton years, a man who had made his reputation finding the precise places where powerful men's legal arguments fell apart. Wade had done work for Curtis Briggs 3 times. He had also, once, refused a job Briggs brought him that he'd understood halfway through the briefing was about intimidation rather than legitimate recovery. Briggs had respected him for the refusal in the specific way that careful men respected other careful men, quietly, and with the understanding that the respect might be useful later. Later had arrived. The second letter went to a woman named Margaret Aldous in St. Louis, who ran a boarding house for working women and had, over 20 years, accumulated a detailed and entirely unofficial knowledge of which men in the city's commercial class had trouble keeping their hands to themselves. Wade had crossed paths with Margaret Aldous twice in his Pinkerton years, once as an adversary and once as an ally. And he trusted her the way you trusted someone who had beaten you fairly, completely and without illusions. The third letter went to Agnes Howell at the Western Territories Matrimonial Bureau in Amarillo, asking specifically about Vera, Dorothy's housekeeper, and whether there was any means of reaching her or establishing communication. The fourth letter was the one Dorothy watched him write most carefully. It was addressed to the Harding Creek Courier, which was what Harding Creek called its weekly 4-page newspaper, and it was a simple, factual statement of public record. That Wade Emmett Hargrove, rancher of the Hargrove property north of Harding Creek, had been lawfully married to Dorothy Ann Callahan of St. Louis, Missouri, on such and such a date before such and such a judge, and that Mrs. Hargrove was residing on the property and engaged in its operation, and that any person with legal business regarding Mrs. Hargrove should direct that business through the Harding Creek Court, rather than arriving unannounced on private land. Dorothy read it twice. "You're making it public," she said. "Harlan's strategy depends on ambiguity," Wade said. "On there being questions about your status, your state of mind, whether your marriage is legitimate. A public record in the local paper is not a legal document, but it's harder to argue with than a filing. It means people here know who you are and why you're here before his lawyer can show up and tell them a different story." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll know we're not hiding." "We're not hiding."
"I don't want to hide." He looked at her. "Do you?" She thought about it with the seriousness she gave everything. "No," she said. "I'm done with hiding. I spent 2 years trying to make myself small enough that Harlan would stop noticing me, and all it did was make me smaller." She looked at the letter. "Send it." He sealed it and set all 4 envelopes in a row on the table, and they looked at them together for a moment, the way you looked at decisions you'd committed to before the consequences had fully arrived. "Curtis Briggs," she said. "You trust him?" "I trust his self-interest. He's built a career on winning cases other lawyers won't touch, because the opposing party has too much money. Harlan Callahan is exactly the kind of case that makes Curtis Briggs's reputation." He paused. "I also trust that he owes me a fair hearing. After that, it's his professional judgment." "And the woman in St. Louis, Margaret Aldous. She knows things about men like Harlan that don't appear in any legal document. She won't testify in court, but she may know someone who will." Dorothy looked at the letter addressed to Agnes Howell. "Vera," she said, and her voice changed on the name, became careful with it. "You think she'd speak?" "I think she unlocked a door at 3 in the morning. I think a woman who does that has already made a decision about what she's willing to do. The question is whether she can do it safely." He looked at Dorothy. "Do you know if she has family, somewhere she could go if she needed to leave the Callahan house?" "A nephew in Kansas City. She talked about him sometimes when Harlan wasn't in the house." A pause. "She called him her retirement plan." "Then she has somewhere to go." Dorothy put her hand flat on the table, not quite touching the envelope with Agnes Howell's name on it. "If Harlan finds out she helped me leave, he'll make her life very difficult. He won't do anything obvious. He never does anything obvious. But he'll find ways." "I know. That's why I'm asking Agnes to make contact carefully and give Vera the choice." He met Dorothy's eyes. "I'm not going to pull someone into this without telling them exactly what they're stepping into. That's not something I do anymore." She heard the anymore. He saw her hear it. The slight shift in her expression that said she was filing it alongside everything else she was learning about him. Building the picture the way she built everything. Methodically, without rushing. Paying attention to the spaces between the obvious things. "You said Harlan knew about your letter to the sheriff," she said. "Means he has eyes somewhere between here and Amarillo." "That's been bothering me too." "Postal Service, you said, or the Bureau in Amarillo." "Or someone in Harding Creek." He said it carefully, watching her face. "I don't know this town the way I should. I've been out here 2 years, and I work alone, and I come in for supplies, and I leave. I don't know who Harlan would find useful." Dorothy's eyes went to the window that faced the direction of town, south and distant. "He doesn't need someone on a payroll. He just needs someone who talks. Someone who would mention to a stranger in a bar
that the rancher north of town had a mail-order bride arrive in rough condition and seemed to be making a situation of it. She paused. He's good at finding the person who talks. Then we stopped giving that person things to say that Harlon can use. She looked back at him. How? By making our situation so thoroughly documented and so publicly known that there's no version of it he can reshape into something that works for him. He picked up the envelope for the courier. This is the start. Curtis Briggs will be the next step. If Vera can be reached and is willing, that's the step after. And if none of it works? Wade was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Texas night was doing what it did. Enormous and dark and full of wind that moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. Then we go to the judge ourselves, he said. We don't wait for Harlon to file. We file first. We put Dorothy's testimony in front of a Texas judge before Harlon's Missouri writ can get its footing here. We make him respond to our case instead of the other way around. Dorothy looked at him steadily. You've been a lawyer. I've worked alongside enough of them. There's a difference. There is. Which is why I need Curtis Briggs. He leaned back in his chair. But the strategy is sound. Harlon's power comes from moving first and controlling the frame. Every legal action he's taken has been first mover action. The guardianship papers, the doctor's affidavit, the Missouri writ. He establishes a story and makes everyone else respond to it. He looked at the envelopes. We take that away from him. Dorothy was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them burned steady and low. Wade, she said. Yeah? I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. He waited. When I got on that stage in Amarillo, I had $43 and one bag, and I was telling myself that I was going to be practical, that this was a transaction, a safe place in exchange for labor and the legal standing of being someone's wife. She looked at her hands on the table. I told myself that was all I was looking for, because wanting more than that felt dangerous. Feeling more than that felt dangerous. A pause. I've been careful my whole life about what I let myself want. Careful about hope, specifically. Hope is expensive when you're in a situation where having it and losing it costs you more than not having it cost in the first place. I understand that, he said quietly. I know you do. That's part of what I'm saying. She looked up at him. In 3 weeks, you have not once made me feel like I owe you something I didn't agree to. You have not once made me feel like the door on that bedroom was a temporary courtesy. You have treated me like a person with a mind and a right to use it. And you have been honest with me about yourself in ways that cost you something to say out loud. She paused. That's not a transaction. That's something else. The lamp flame moved in a breath of air. Dorothy, let me finish. She said it gently but firmly. I'm not telling you this because I think you need to know it. I'm telling you this because I've been walking around with it for 10 days, and holding it in is starting to cost me energy I need for other things. A small exhale, something between exasperation and honesty. I'm not afraid of this, of whatever this is. I was afraid of everything for 2 years, and I am specifically not afraid of this. And that seems important enough to say out loud. Wade looked at her across the lamp, at the woman who had catalogued her father-in-law's cruelties with the flat precision of someone who had learned that the only way to survive a thing was to see it clearly, who had rebuilt her body and remade his root cellar and planted a garden with cracked ribs and negotiated for chickens from a neighbor 15 miles away and stood in the open air in front of the man who had broken her jaw and had not looked away. I'm not afraid of it either, he said. I've been less careful about that than I meant to be. Less careful how? I started caring about whether you slept, whether you ate enough, what you thought about the east fence situation. He looked at the table. I notice when you're watching the road. I notice when the almost laugh gets loose. I've been counting them. She blinked. You've been counting my almost laughs? 4, he said. In 3 weeks. That one just now when I said Harlon's visit was progress was the 4th. She looked at him for a long moment. And then something happened that hadn't happened yet in 3 weeks. She laughed. Actually laughed, fully, without catching it, without the split lip to stop it, without the careful architecture of control managing the expression before it could commit. It was brief and real and slightly disbelieving, and it changed her face entirely into something that had nothing haunted in it at all. 5, she said when she got her breath. 5, he agreed. The night had gone quiet outside, the wind settling into its later, calmer register. The lamp burned between them, and the 4 envelopes sat in their row on the table, and the weight of Harlon Callahan and Missouri Ritz and the clock that was still running had not gone anywhere. But something had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them was afraid of it. I should tell you, Dorothy said after a moment, that I don't know how to do this. Do what? Whatever this is, the choosing. I chose Frank because I was 23 and scared, and he was kind, and his family had standing, and marrying him seemed safer than not marrying him. She said it honestly, without self-pity. That is not a good basis for choosing. And afterward, I didn't choose anything for 2 years, because there was nothing to choose between. She looked at him. I don't actually know what it looks like to choose something because I want it. I'm not sure I do either, Wade said. I chose the Pinkerton work because I was good at it, and it paid well, and I didn't ask myself hard questions about it until I had to. He paused. First thing I chose for the right reasons was this land. Took me a long time to learn to choose like that. How did you know you were choosing right? He thought about it. When the thought of not choosing it felt worse than the fear of choosing it, he said. When I couldn't talk myself out of it with reasonable arguments. Dorothy was quiet. I can't talk myself out of this with reasonable arguments, she said finally. I've tried. So have I. Outside, the wind picked up again briefly and moved through the cottonwoods with that sound they made, the particular rushing whisper that Wade had stopped hearing 2 years ago and had started hearing again sometime in the last 3 weeks. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, he said. I want to be clear about that. The situation with Harlon is real, and it's moving, and we deal with that on its own terms. Whatever this is between us, that's separate. It moves at its own pace. I know. She stood, carrying the lamp toward the bedroom, and stopped at the door. Wade. Yeah? You should know that the reason I came outside to stand beside you when Harlon arrived? She paused. It wasn't because I'm brave. It was because standing beside you felt safer than standing anywhere alone. And that felt important to understand about myself. She went into the bedroom. The door stayed open. Wade sat at the table for a while after. The 4 envelopes in their row, the lamp gone, the room in firelight only. The low, familiar light of a place he'd built for himself that had, without his planning it, become something larger than himself. He thought about Curtis Briggs and Margaret Aldis and Vera somewhere in St. Louis, with her nephew in Kansas City as her retirement plan. He thought about the Harding Creek Courier and the public record it would create. He thought about Harlon Callahan riding south toward Amarillo with his Missouri writ and his patience and the specific fury of a man who had looked at something he thought he owned and found it looking back. He thought about Dorothy saying the words, choosing right, and meaning them. Then a sound came up the road. One rider, moving fast. Not the measured pace of someone arriving, the urgent pace of someone coming with news. Wade had his boots on and was at the door before the rider pulled up outside. It was Billy Alcott, not the boy from the water barrel. His father, Thomas Alcott, who ran the livery in town and had no reason to be on the road north at this hour, unless the reason was significant. "Hargrove!" Alcott pulled his horse up, breathing hard from the ride. "Telegram came in on the evening wire addressed to your wife. Postmaster said it was marked urgent." He held out the envelope. "I figured you'd want it tonight." Wade took it. "Thank you, Thomas." "Didn't read it," Alcott said, "but the postmaster did. Said you should know. It came from a law firm. Boston address." He turned his horse and rode back toward town. Wade stood in the doorway with the envelope in his hand. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. The cattle were quiet in the far pasture. "I heard," Dorothy said from behind him. He turned. She was in the doorway, her hair loose, her arms crossed against the night cold, watching him with that gray-green gaze that missed nothing. He held out the envelope. She crossed the porch and took it, and opened it with steady hands, angling the paper toward the last of the firelight coming through the window. He watched her read it, watched her face. She read it once, then she read it again. When she looked up, her expression was something he hadn't seen on her face before. Not fear, not anger, not the careful, managed neutrality she'd arrived with 3 weeks ago. It was the expression of someone who had just seen the shape of the real fight, fully and clearly, for the first time. "He's filed in federal court," she said. "Interstate jurisdiction." She lowered the paper slowly. "Harlon found a federal judge in Missouri. The filing claims I was taken across state lines under false pretenses. It claims our marriage is fraudulent." She paused. "It claims you have a criminal history that renders you unfit." The Pinkerton file. The Colorado mine strike. 3 men. Wade's name in the company record as the agent who gave the order to advance. Harlon had found it. Dorothy was looking at him with steady eyes, and he understood that she was waiting for him to say something that was true. "The Colorado record is real," he said. "I told you what happened." "I know what happened," she said. "I know your version, and I believe your version. The question is what a federal judge will do with Harlon's version." She folded the telegram carefully. "This isn't the legal process being slow anymore. This is Harlon finding the fastest way to the outcome he wants." She looked at him. "We needed weeks. He's given us days." Wade looked at the road going south, dark and empty in the night. Curtis Briggs needed to move faster than Wade had asked him to. Margaret Aldous needed to find whatever she knew, faster. Agnes Howell needed to reach Vera, faster. And 2 people standing on a porch in the Texas dark needed to decide what they were willing to do and how quickly they were willing to do it. "Come inside," Dorothy said. Her voice was calm and her eyes were clear. "We have letters to rewrite." He followed her inside. The door closed against the Texas night, and in the cottonwoods, the wind moved through the branches with that sound that was almost like voices, steady and certain and refusing to be still. They rewrote the letters that night by firelight, Wade dictating and Dorothy refining, the 2 of them working at the table with the telegram from Boston open between them like a map of territory they were going to have to cross, whether they were ready or not. The letter to Curtis Briggs was rewritten first and most urgently. Wade told him everything: the Colorado file, the 3 men, the specific language of the Pinkerton record that Harlon's lawyers had clearly found and would use. He did not soften it or frame it favorably. He wrote it the way he had learned to write the things that mattered, which was straight through the center of them without flinching, because a lawyer who didn't know the worst of a case going in was a lawyer walking into an ambush. Curtis Briggs would either take this case knowing the full shape of it, or he wouldn't take it. And either way, Wade needed to know now, not after the federal filing had moved 2 steps forward. Dorothy watched him write that letter with the same steady attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she read it and made one change. A single sentence near the end that Wade had written as an explanation, and she rewrote as a statement of fact. The difference was small and exactly right. "You're better at this than you let on," he said. "I had 2 years of watching Harlon write letters," she said. "I learned what the ones that worked looked like." The letter to Margaret Aldous was shorter and more direct than the first version. Wade asked her specifically about Harlon Callahan by name, about any women in her network who had left Callahan-connected households, and about whether there was documentation of any kind that existed outside the official record. He told her a federal filing was in motion, and time was the problem. Margaret Aldous was a woman who understood time as a problem. She would move or she wouldn't, but she would understand the stakes. The letter to Agnes Howell was the one Dorothy wrote herself. Wade started it, and then set down the pen and said, "Vera's yours. You should be the one to ask." Dorothy took the pen and wrote for 10 minutes without stopping. And when she finished, she didn't offer it to Wade to read, and he didn't ask. Some words were private and still carried weight regardless. They rode into Harding Creek before sunrise to catch the morning post. The street was empty and gray, the town not yet awake, and Wade hammered on the postmaster's door until the man appeared in his nightshirt with a lamp and an expression that said he was deeply unhappy about the hour. Wade paid double the standard rate, which converted the unhappiness into professional cooperation, and watched all 4 envelopes disappear into the outgoing bag. Dorothy stood beside him on the postmaster's porch and looked at the empty street and said, "Now we wait. Now we prepare," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "What do we prepare for?" "For the hearing. If Briggs takes the case, he'll need us in person. Federal jurisdiction means the hearing could be called in Amarillo or Dallas. We need to be ready to go at short notice." He paused. "And we need to talk to Sheriff Whitmore here in Harding Creek before Harlan's lawyers do." They found Sheriff Cal Whitmore at his office at 7 in the morning, which was when he arrived every morning and when he left every evening. A man of such consistent habit that the town had stopped thinking of his schedule as a choice and started thinking of it as a natural phenomenon, like sunrise. He was 53, broad through the shoulders, with a gray mustache and the specific quality of patience that came from having seen enough of human nature to stop being surprised by it. Wade laid the situation out for him plainly, starting from Dorothy's arrival and ending with the federal filing, leaving nothing out that was material. Dorothy sat across from Whitmore and answered his questions directly and without elaboration, the way she answered all questions, with exactly what was asked for, and nothing performed around it. Whitmore listened to all of it. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way men looked at ceilings when they were running calculations they didn't want interrupted. "Federal filing is serious," he said finally. "I know," Wade said. "Means I can't just tell his lawyers to take their Missouri writ and their concerns back across the state line. Means there's a process I have to respect, whether I like it or not." He looked at Dorothy. "Mrs. Hargrove, that doctor's affidavit he has, the one saying you were unstable." "It's fabricated," Dorothy said. "The doctor examined me once, for 20 minutes, 6 weeks after Frank died, when I was actively grieving, and Harlan had just told me the property wasn't mine. I was not unstable. I was devastated. There is a difference." She held Whitmore's gaze without blinking. "I also have scars that predate any claim of instability. Physical evidence of what Harlan Callahan's management capacity looked like in practice." Whitmore held her gaze for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. Not with sympathy, with the flat, practical certainty of a man who had been reading people for 30 years and had made up his mind. I'm going to make a call on the federal court in Amarillo this morning. Not on your behalf officially. I don't have standing to intervene in a federal matter. But I have a working relationship with Judge Elias Croft there, and I can tell him what the situation looks like from where I'm sitting. He picked up his pen. Can't promise it moves the needle, but Croft is a fair man, and he does not appreciate having his court used as a tool for out-of-state grievance. Thank you, Cal, Wade said. Don't thank me yet. Whitmore pointed the pen at him. That Colorado business. Pinkerton record. Real, Wade said. Exactly as Harlan's filing will describe it. You have anything to say about it that a reasonable man would want to hear? I gave the order. 3 men died. I left the agency 2 months later, and I have been living with it since. He said it the way he'd said it to Dorothy in the wagon on the first day. Straight and without dressing. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm asking for a fair hearing. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. That's all any man can ask for, he said, and picked up his telephone. They rode back to the ranch in the early morning light, the land opening up around them in that way it had, enormous and quiet, and entirely indifferent to the federal court in Amarillo, and Harlon Callahan's lawyers, and the clock running underneath everything. The garden rows were visible from the road as they came over the last rise, dark and green and growing. Dorothy looked at them as they rode past, said nothing, but her shoulders, which had been set hard since the telegram arrived the night before, came down a degree. The response from Curtis Briggs arrived in 6 days. Not a letter, a telegram, which meant Briggs had read Wade's letter and made his decision fast, and wanted Wade to know it fast, which told Wade everything about how Briggs had assessed the situation before he'd even read the content of the message. It said, Case accepted. Filing counterpetition, Federal Court, Amarillo, tomorrow. Need you and Mrs. Hargrove present Friday. Bring everything. C.B.C. Dorothy read it over Wade's shoulder. Friday is 3 days, she said. Then we have 3 days. She was already moving toward the bedroom to begin organizing what they needed. He watched her go and thought about what 3 days meant. 3 days to prepare testimony, to gather every document they had, to be ready to stand in front of a federal judge and tell the true version of a story that Harlon Callahan's money had been paying someone to tell a different way. He thought about the Colorado file, about what it would look like to a judge who was hearing it for the first time from Harlan's framing, before Wade had the chance to speak. About the 3 men, and the order, and the thing he had been carrying for 3 years that was about to be put on a table in a courtroom and examined by strangers. He thought about Dorothy saying, standing beside you felt safer than standing anywhere alone. He went to help her pack. They arrived in Amarillo on Thursday evening and found Curtis Briggs waiting for them at the hotel he had reserved. A small, wiry man with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, who shook Wade's hand and then turned to Dorothy and said, Mrs. Hargrove, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I want you to know that the letter Agnes Howell sent to my office on your behalf is one of the most thorough pieces of character documentation I have ever read. You have allies you may not fully know about. Dorothy looked at him carefully. What letter from Agnes Howell? Arrived 2 days ago, 8 pages. Briggs opened his briefcase and produced it, and Dorothy sat down in the hotel lobby chair and read it while Wade and Briggs stood and waited, and the evening traffic of Amarillo moved past the windows. Agnes Howell had written, in 8 careful pages, everything she knew about Dorothy Callahan's arrival at the Bureau, the condition she had arrived in, the physician's documentation she had insisted on completing before Dorothy left Amarillo, and the 2 contacts she had made on Dorothy's behalf in the weeks since. The first contact was with Margaret Aldous in St. Louis, who had confirmed through her network 3 women who had left Callahan-adjacent households in the past 5 years. citing what one of them called systematic and deliberate diminishment. None of them had documented anything officially. Two of them were willing to provide written statements. One was willing to testify in person. The second contact was with Vera. Dorothy stopped reading when she reached Vera's name. Stopped for long enough that Briggs and Wade both looked at her. She kept reading. Vera had left the Callahan household 4 days after Dorothy's departure, when Harlon had made it clear, through a series of small and precise actions, that he understood she had been involved in Dorothy's escape and intended to make that understanding felt. Vera was currently in Kansas City with her nephew. She had taken with her, when she left, a small tin box she had been keeping in her room for 3 years. The tin box contained letters, 14 letters, written by Harlon Callahan to his personal physician in St. Louis, spanning the period of Dorothy's marriage to Frank and the 2 years following Frank's death. Vera had opened Harlon's mail on a Thursday morning 3 years ago, when the physician's response had arrived on a day Harlon was traveling. Read it, understood what she was reading, and made a decision. She had been making a copy of each subsequent letter ever since. She had never told anyone. She had been waiting, she told Agnes Howell, for a door that needed unlocking. The letters documented, in Harlon Callahan's own handwriting, his instructions to his physician regarding Dorothy's medical record, what diagnoses to assign, what language to use, what the physician should be prepared to certify if the situation required certifying. They were not the letters of a man acting out of concern. They were the letters of a man building a cage and making sure the lock worked. Dorothy finished the last page and sat still for a moment with the papers in her lap. Then she said, "Vera," very quietly, the way she had said the name in the cabin when Wade had asked about her. "Careful with it." "She'll testify," Briggs said. "I spoke with her by telephone this morning. She's prepared to come to Amarillo. She said—" He checked his notes. "She said she's been waiting 2 years for someone to ask the right question." Dorothy pressed her hand flat against the papers in her lap. Her jaw was set hard against something, and Wade recognized what she was managing. Not grief, not fear, but the specific, overwhelming quality of being helped by someone when you had been alone for so long that being helped felt almost too large to hold. He sat down beside her in the lobby chair and said nothing. After a moment, she straightened. "Tell me what Friday looks like," she said to Briggs. "All business, all forward." Briggs told them. The hearing was before Judge Elias Croft, who was, as Sheriff Whitmore had indicated, a fair man who did not appreciate having his court used as a tool. Harlon's filing would be presented first, which was the procedural requirement. Then Briggs would present the counterpetition, which included Dorothy's testimony, the physician's documentation from Amarillo, Agnes Howell's 8 pages, Vera's letters, and the statements from the 2 women in St. Louis. "The Colorado record," Briggs said, looking at Wade. "Tell me what it costs us." "Honestly, less than you think. Harlon's filing uses it to argue your character. Judge Croft will have already been briefed by Whitmore, who I understand made a call earlier this week." Briggs paused. "What helps you is that you disclosed it voluntarily, fully, without prompting, in your letter to me. A man using a woman as cover for his own interests doesn't write a letter like that. Croft will see that." He looked at Wade steadily. "You'll be asked about it directly. You answer the same way you wrote it, straight and without dressing." "I know how to do that," Wade said. "I know you do. That's why I took this case." The morning of the hearing was clear and cold, the Texas sky doing its enormous work overhead, the kind of sky that put human proceedings in their proper scale without being unkind about it. They arrived at the federal courthouse an hour early. Briggs went inside to prepare. Wade and Dorothy stood on the courthouse steps for a moment in the cold morning air. She was dressed in her best, the dark blue calico she had arrived in, mended and pressed, her dark red hair up and pinned. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had come a long way to tell the truth in public, and intended to do it without flinching. "You ready?" Wade said. "I've been ready since I got on the stage in Amarillo," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." He held the door open, and she walked through it. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Harlon Callahan sat at the opposing table with 2 lawyers and the specific stillness of a man who had done this kind of thing before and believed in his own position with the serene certainty of someone who had never seriously lost. He looked at Dorothy twice when she was sworn in, and both times she looked back. She testified for 40 minutes. She answered every question Harlon's lawyers put to her with the same precision and economy she brought to everything. Not more than was asked, not less than was true, her voice steady throughout, her hands still on the table in front of her. When Harlon's lawyer produced the doctor's affidavit, she said, "I would like to note for the record that the physician who produced that document examined me for 20 minutes while I was actively grieving my husband's death, and that I have documentation from a second physician in Amarillo, conducted 6 weeks ago, that describes my mental and physical condition in full." She paused. "I would also like to note that Mr. Callahan's correspondence with that first physician, spanning 3 years, is currently before this court." Harlon looked at his lawyers. The look of a man understanding that a door he had never expected to be opened had been opened, and that everything behind it was now visible. Vera testified by written statement, read into the record by Briggs in a flat, professional voice that somehow made the letters more devastating than they would have been with drama attached to them. Harlon's own words, in his own handwriting, read aloud in a federal courthouse in Amarillo, Texas, with the morning sun coming through the windows, and Judge Croft's face doing the work of a man who was hearing something that confirmed something he had already suspected. Wade testified last. He answered the Colorado question the same way he had written it to Briggs, the same way he had said it to Dorothy in the wagon on the first day. Straight through the center of it, without softening, without the explanation that was really an excuse. He said he had given the order. He said 3 men had died. He said he had resigned 2 months later and had not worked for the Pinkerton Agency or any similar organization since. He said he had bought 400 acres of Texas land and put his name on the deed and had been attempting every day since to be the kind of man the other kind of man he had been would not recognize. Judge Croft asked him one question that Harlon's lawyers had not asked. "Mr. Hargrove, do you believe your wife's account of her time in the Callahan household?" "Yes, sir," Wade said, "completely and without reservation. And not because she's my wife. Because I have spent 3 weeks watching how a person who has been told repeatedly that her own perception is wrong moves through the world. I have watched her relearn what it felt like to be right about things. And I have watched her stand in front of the man who did that to her and not look away." He paused. "I believe her because she is one of the most honest people I have ever known, and because the evidence in this courtroom is consistent with everything she told me from the first day she arrived." Croft wrote something down. The ruling came that afternoon. Harlon Callahan's federal petition was dismissed. The Missouri writ was found to have no standing in Texas jurisdiction. The guardianship claim was formally dissolved, the dissolution retroactive to Dorothy's 25th birthday, which had passed 3 years before her marriage to Frank, and which, the judge noted in language that was dry and precise and utterly final, should have terminated the guardianship entirely at that time, regardless of subsequent arrangements. The marriage of Wade Emmett Hargrove and Dorothy Ann Callahan was affirmed as legitimate, entered into freely, and recorded as such in the federal court of Amarillo, Texas. The judge looked at Harlon Callahan at the end and said, without particular emotion. "Mr. Callahan, this court is not a collection agency for arrangements that the other party has declined to honor. I would strongly advise you to spend your resources elsewhere." Harlon stood and buttoned his jacket and did not look at Dorothy. He walked out of the courtroom without a word, his two lawyers behind him, and the door swung shut. And that was the last time Dorothy Callahan Hargrove ever saw her father-in-law. She sat still for a moment after he left. Then she exhaled, long and slow, the way she had exhaled on the yard after facing him down 3 weeks ago. And this time, there was nothing left on the other side of it but air. Briggs shook their hands, gathered his papers, made 3 efficient remarks about follow-up documentation, and was gone. The courtroom emptied. Croft had already returned to his chambers. The building went quiet around them. Dorothy and Wade sat alone in the federal courthouse in Amarillo, with the afternoon sun falling through the tall windows and the ruling on the table between them. And neither of them said anything for a while, because there was too much to say, and no order in which to say it. And both of them understood that some things didn't need saying to be fully understood. Dorothy picked up the ruling and folded it carefully and put it in her bag. "Vera is in Kansas City," she said finally. "I know. I want to write to her. Tell her—" She paused, looking for the right words, and then set them aside. "I'll know what to say when I sit down to write it." "You always do." She looked at him. The gray-green eyes that had been doing careful inventory since the moment she stepped off the stage in Harding Creek, reading and assessing and cataloging, were doing something different now. Not calculating, not guarding, just looking. At him, directly, without the architecture of caution between them. "We should go home," she said. That word, in her voice, with that weight in it. Not a transaction, not a temporary arrangement pending further review. Home. The specific home that was 400 acres of Texas land, with a spring-fed well, and a garden she had planted, and chickens she had negotiated for, and a south pasture fence she had told him to reset properly. "Yeah," he said, "we should." They rode north out of Amarillo in the late afternoon, with the sky going enormous and golden behind them, the land flattening into the familiar open distance of the Panhandle. The horses moved at their own pace, and neither of them hurried them. They had been hurrying toward this for weeks, and their hurrying was finished, and there was no urgency left in the world, except the good kind, the kind that came from heading toward something instead of away from it. Somewhere north of the city, when the road was empty in both directions, and the land was doing what land does at the end of a clear day in Texas, Dorothy reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. Not carefully, not tentatively. The way you took something that was yours. He held on. They came over the last rise in the last of the light, and the homestead lay below them in the shallow draw, the cottonwoods dark against the sky, the windmill turning, the lamp they'd left burning in the window, sending its small, steady light out into the gathering dark. The garden rows were invisible in the dusk, but he knew they were there, growing in their patient way, doing what properly planted things did when they'd been given good ground and enough light, and someone who intended to come back to them. Dorothy looked at it for a moment from the rise, the way she had looked at it on the first day, with the same assessment, the same careful inventory. But the thing she was looking for was different now, and what she found was different too. "Second chances," she said quietly, almost to herself. Not a question, not a wish. A statement of fact about what they had built and what it had cost and what it was worth. "Second chances," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her. And between them was everything that had happened since the stagecoach door opened on a street in Harding Creek, and a woman hit the ground in the Texas dust, while 20 people looked the other way, and one man didn't. They rode down toward the light. They were home, chosen, earned, and entirely their own. And they did not look back.